Chapter 14 of The Secret Garden. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Karen Savage. The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 14. A Young Rajah. The moor was hidden in mist when the morning came, and the rain had not stopped pouring down. There could be no going out of doors. Martha was so busy that Mary had no opportunity of talking to her, but in the afternoon she asked her to come and sit with her in the nursery. She came bringing the stocking she was always knitting when she was doing nothing else. "What's the matter with thee?" she asked as soon as they sat down. "Thou looks as if tha'd something to say." "I have. I found out what the crying was," said Mary. Martha let her knitting drop on her knee and gazed at her with startled eyes. "Tha hasn't!" she exclaimed. "Never!" "I heard it in the night," Mary went on, "and I got up and went to see where it came from. It was Colin. I found him." Martha's face became red with fright. "Eh, Miss Mary," she said, half crying, "tha shouldn't have done it. Tha shouldn't. Tha'll get me in trouble. I never told thee nothing about him, but tha'll get me in trouble. I shall lose my place, and what'll mother do?" "You won't lose your place," said Mary. "He was glad I came. We talked and talked, and he said he was glad I came." "Was he?" cried Martha. "Art tha sure? Tha doesn't know what he's like when anything vexes him. He's a big lad to cry like a baby, but when he's in a passion he'll fair scream just to frighten us. He knows us daren't call our souls our own." "He wasn't vexed," said Mary. "I asked him if I should go away, and he made me stay. He asked me questions, and I sat on a big footstool and talked to him about India and about the robin and gardens. He wouldn't let me go. He let me see his mother's picture. Before I left him I sang him to sleep." Martha fairly gasped with amazement. "I can scarcely believe thee," she protested. "It's as if tha'd walked straight into a lion's den. If he'd been like he is most times, he'd have throwed himself into one of his tantrums and roused the house. He won't let strangers look at him. He let me look at him. I looked at him all the time, and he looked at me. We stared," said Mary. "I don't know what to do," cried agitated Martha. "If Mrs. Medlock finds out, she'll think I broke orders and told thee, and I shall be packed back to mother." "He is not going to tell Mrs. Medlock anything about it yet. It's to be a sort of secret just at first," said Mary firmly. "And he says everybody is obliged to do as he pleases." "Aye, that's true enough, the bad lad," sighed Martha, wiping her forehead with her apron. "He says Mrs. Medlock must, and he wants me to come and talk to him every day. And you are to tell me when he wants me." "Me?" said Martha. "I shall lose my place, I shall for sure." "You can't if you're doing what he wants you to do, and everybody is ordered to obey him," Mary argued. "Does that mean to say," cried Martha with wide open eyes, "that he was nice to thee?" "I think he almost liked me," Mary answered. "Then thou must have bewitched him," decided Martha, drawing a long breath. "Do you mean magic?" inquired Mary. "I've heard about magic in India, but I can't make it. I just went into his room, and I was so surprised to see him I stood and stared. And then he turned round and stared at me. And he thought I was a ghost or a dream, and I thought perhaps he was. And it was so queer being there alone together in the middle of the night and not knowing each other. And we began to ask each other questions, and then I asked him if I must go away, and he said I must not." "The world's coming to an end," gasped Martha. "What is the matter with him?" asked Mary. "Nobody knows for sure and certain," said Martha. "Mr. Craven went off his head like when he was born. The doctor said he'd have to be put in asylum. It was because Mrs. Craven died, like I told you. He wouldn't set eyes on the baby. He just raved and said it'd be another hunchback like him and it had better die." "Is Colin a hunchback?" Mary asked. "He didn't look like one." "He isn't yet," said Martha. "But he began all wrong. Mother said that there was enough trouble and raging in the house to set any child wrong. They was afraid his back was weak, and they've always been taking care of it, keeping him lying down and not letting him walk. Once they made him wear a brace, but he fretted so he was downright ill. Then a big doctor came to see him and made them take it off. He talked to t'other doctor quite rough, in a polite way. He said there'd been too much medicine and too much letting him have his own way." "I think he's a very spoiled boy," said Mary. "He's the worst young nowt as ever was," said Martha. "I won't say as he hasn't been ill a good bit. He's had coughs and colds that's nearly killed him 2 or 3 times. Once he had rheumatic fever, and once he had typhoid. Mrs. Medlock did get a fright then. He'd been out of his head, and she was talking to the nurse, thinking he didn't know nothing, and she said, 'He'll die this time sure enough, and best thing for him and for everybody.' And she looked at him, and there he was with his big eyes open, staring at her as sensible as she was herself. She didn't know what happened, but he just stared at her and says, 'You give me some water and stop talking.'" "Do you think he will die?" asked Mary. "Mother says there's no reason why any child should live that gets no fresh air and doesn't do nothing but lie on his back and read picture books and take medicine. He's weak and hates the trouble of being taken out of doors, and he gets cold so easy he says it makes him ill." Mary sat and looked at the fire. "I wonder," she said slowly, "if it would not do him good to go out into a garden and watch things growing. It did me good." "One of the worst fits he ever had," said Martha, "was one time they took him out where the roses is by the fountain. He'd been reading in a paper about people getting something he called rose cold, and he began to sneeze and said he'd got it, and then a new gardener as didn't know the rules passed by and looked at him curious. He threw himself into a passion and said he'd looked at him because he was going to be a hunchback. He cried himself into a fever and was ill all night." "If he ever gets angry at me, I'll never go and see him again," said Mary. "He'll have thee if he wants thee," said Martha. "Thou may as well know that at the start." Very soon afterward a bell rang and she rolled up her knitting. "I dare say the nurse wants me to stay with him a bit," she said. "I hope he's in a good temper." She was out of the room about 10 minutes, and then she came back with a puzzled expression. "Well, that has bewitched him," she said. "He's up on his sofa with his picture books. He's told the nurse to stay away until 6 o'clock. I'm to wait in the next room. The minute she was gone he called me to him and says, 'I want Mary Lennox to come and talk to me, and remember you're not to tell anyone. You'd better go as quick as you can.'" Mary was quite willing to go quickly. She did not want to see Colin as much as she wanted to see Dickon, but she wanted to see him very much. There was a bright fire on the hearth when she entered his room, and in the daylight she saw it was a very beautiful room indeed. There were rich colours in the rugs and hangings and pictures and books on the walls, which made it look glowing and comfortable, even in spite of the grey sky and falling rain. Colin looked rather like a picture himself. He was wrapped in a velvet dressing gown and sat against a big brocaded cushion. He had a red spot on each cheek. "Come in," he said. "I've been thinking about you all morning." "I've been thinking about you too," answered Mary. "You don't know how frightened Martha is. She says Mrs. Medlock will think she told me about you, and then she will be sent away." He frowned. "Go and tell her to come here," he said. "She's in the next room." Mary went and brought her back. Poor Martha was shaking in her shoes. Colin was still frowning. "Have you to do what I please, or have you not?" he demanded. "I have to do what you please, sir," Martha faltered, turning quite red. "Has Medlock to do what I please?" "Everybody has, sir," said Martha. "Well then, if I order you to bring Miss Mary to me, how can Medlock send you away if she finds it out?" "Please don't let her, sir," pleaded Martha. "I'll send her away if she dares to say a word about such a thing," said Master Craven grandly. "She wouldn't like that, I can tell you." "Thank you, sir," bobbing a curtsy. "I want to do my duty, sir." "What I want is your duty," said Colin, more grandly still. "I'll take care of you. Now go away." When the door closed behind Martha, Colin found Mistress Mary gazing at him as if he had set her wondering. "Why do you look at me like that?" he asked her. "What are you thinking about?" "I'm thinking about 2 things." "What are they? Sit down and tell me." "This is the first one," said Mary, seating herself on the big stool. "Once in India I saw a boy who was a Rajah. He had rubies and emeralds and diamonds stuck all over him. He spoke to his people just as you spoke to Martha. Everybody had to do everything he told them, in a minute. I think they would have been killed if they hadn't." "I shall make you tell me about Rajahs presently," he said. "But first tell me what the second thing was." "I was thinking," said Mary, "how different you are from Dickon." "Who is Dickon?" he said. "What a queer name." She might as well tell him. She thought she could talk about Dickon without mentioning the secret garden. She had liked to hear Martha talk about him. Besides, she longed to talk about him. It would seem to bring him nearer. "He is Martha's brother. He is 12 years old," she explained. "He is not like anyone else in the world. He can charm foxes and squirrels and birds, just as the natives in India charm snakes. He plays a very soft tune on a pipe, and they come and listen." There were some big books on a table at his side, and he dragged one suddenly toward him. "There is a picture of a snake charmer in this," he exclaimed. "Come and look at it." The book was a beautiful one with superb coloured illustrations, and he turned to one of them. "Can he do that?" he asked eagerly. He played on his pipe and they listened, Mary explained. But he doesn't call it magic. He says it's because he lives on the moor so much and he knows their ways. He says he feels sometimes as if he was a bird or a rabbit himself, he likes them so. I think he asked the robin questions. It seemed as if they talked to each other in soft chirps. Colin lay back on his cushion and his eyes grew larger and larger and the spots on his cheeks burned. "Tell me some more about him," he said. "He knows all about eggs and nests," Mary went on, "and he knows where foxes and badgers and otters live. He keeps them secret so that other boys won't find their holes and frighten them. He knows about everything that grows or lives on the moor." "Does he like the moor?" said Colin. "How can he when it's such a great, bare, dreary place?" "It's the most beautiful place," protested Mary. "Thousands of lovely things grow on it, and there are thousands of little creatures all busy building nests and making holes and burrows and chippering or singing or squeaking to each other. They're so busy and having such fun under the earth or in the trees or heather. It's their world." "How do you know all that?" said Colin, turning on his elbow to look at her. "I have never been there once, really," said Mary, suddenly remembering. "I only drove over it in the dark. I thought it was hideous. Martha told me about it at first, and then Dickon. When Dickon talks about it, you feel as if you saw things and heard them, and as if you were standing in the heather with the sun shining and the gorse smelling like honey and all full of bees and butterflies." "You never see anything if you are ill," said Colin restlessly. He looked like a person listening to a new sound in the distance and wondering what it was. "You can't if you stay in a room," said Mary. "I couldn't go on the moor," he said in a resentful tone. Mary was silent for a minute, and then she said something bold. "You might. Sometime." He moved as if he was startled. "Go on the moor? How could I? I'm going to die." "How do you know?" said Mary unsympathetically. She didn't like the way he had of talking about dying. She did not feel very sympathetic. She felt rather as if he almost boasted about it. "Oh, I've heard it ever since I remember," he answered crossly. "They're always whispering about it and thinking I don't notice. They wish I would, too." Mistress Mary felt quite contrary. She pinched her lips together. "If they wished I would," she said, "I wouldn't. Who wishes you would?" "The servants. And of course Dr. Craven, because he would get Misselthwaite and be rich instead of poor. He daren't say so, but he always looks cheerful when I am worse. When I had typhoid fever his face got quite fat. I think my father wishes it too." "I don't believe he does," said Mary quite obstinately. That made Colin turn and look at her again. "Don't you?" he said. And then he lay back on his cushion and was still, as if he were thinking, and there was quite a long silence. Perhaps they were both of them thinking strange things children do not usually think. "I like the grand doctor from London because he made them take the iron thing off," said Mary at last. "Did he say you were going to die?" "No." "What did he say?" "He didn't whisper," Colin answered. "Perhaps he knew I hated whispering. I heard him say one thing quite aloud. He said, 'The lad might live if he would make up his mind to it. Put him in the humour.' It sounded as if he was in a temper." "I'll tell you who would put you in the humour, perhaps," said Mary, reflecting. She felt as if she would like this thing to be settled one way or the other. "I believe Dickon would. He's always talking about live things. He never talks about dead things or things that are ill. He's always looking up in the sky to watch birds flying, or looking down at the earth to see something growing. He has such round blue eyes, and they're so wide open with looking about, and he laughs such a big laugh with his wide mouth, and his cheeks are as red as cherries." She pulled her stool nearer to the sofa, and her expression quite changed at the remembrance of the wide curving mouth and wide open eyes. "See here," she said, "don't let us talk about dying. I don't like it. Let us talk about living. Let us talk about Dickon, and then we will look at your pictures." It was the best thing she could have said. To talk about Dickon meant to talk about the moor, and about the cottage and the 14 people who lived in it on 16 shillings a week, and the children who got fat on the moor grass like the wild ponies, and about Dickon's mother, and the skipping rope, and the moor with the sun on it, and about pale green points sticking up out of the black sod. And it was all so alive that Mary talked more than she had ever talked before, and Colin both talked and listened as he had never done either before, and they both began to laugh over nothings as children will when they are happy together, and they laughed so that in the end they were making as much noise as if they had been two ordinary, healthy, natural 10-year-old creatures, instead of a hard little unloving girl and a sickly boy who believed that he was going to die. They enjoyed themselves so much that they forgot the pictures and they forgot about the time. They had been laughing quite loudly over Ben Weatherstaff and his robin, and Colin was actually sitting up as if he had forgotten about his weak back, when he suddenly remembered something. "Do you know, there is one thing we have never once thought of," he said. "We are cousins." It seemed so queer that they had talked so much and never remembered this simple thing that they laughed more than ever, because they had got into the humour to laugh at anything. And in the midst of the fun, the door opened, and in walked Dr. Craven and Mrs. Medlock. Dr. Craven started in actual alarm, and Mrs. Medlock almost fell back because he had accidentally bumped against her. "Good Lord!" exclaimed poor Mrs. Medlock, with her eyes almost starting out of her head. "Good Lord!" "What is this?" said Dr. Craven, coming forward. "What does it mean?" Then Mary was reminded of the boy Rajah again. Colin answered as if neither the doctor's alarm nor Mrs. Medlock's terror were of the slightest consequence. He was as little disturbed or frightened as if an elderly cat and dog had walked into the room. "This is my cousin, Mary Lennox," he said. "I asked her to come and talk to me. I like her. She must come and talk to me whenever I send for her." Dr. Craven turned reproachfully to Mrs. Medlock. "Oh, sir," she panted, "I don't know how it's happened. There's not a servant on the place that dare to talk. They all have their orders." "Nobody told her anything," said Colin. "She heard me crying and found me herself. I am glad she came. Don't be silly, Medlock." Mary saw that Dr. Craven did not look pleased, but it was quite plain that he dared not oppose his patient. He sat down by Colin and felt his pulse. "I am afraid there has been too much excitement. Excitement is not good for you, my boy," he said. "I should be excited if she kept away," answered Colin, his eyes beginning to look dangerously sparkling. "I am better. She makes me better. The nurse must bring up her tea with mine. We will have tea together." Mrs. Medlock and Dr. Craven looked at each other in a troubled way, but there was evidently nothing to be done. "He does look rather better, sir," ventured Mrs. Medlock, "but, thinking the matter over, he looked better this morning before she came into the room." "She came into the room last night. She stayed with me a long time. She sang a Hindustani song to me and it made me go to sleep," said Colin. "I was better when I wakened up. I wanted my breakfast. I want my tea now. Tell nurse, Mrs. Medlock." Dr. Craven did not stay very long. He talked to the nurse for a few minutes when she came into the room, and said a few words of warning to Colin. He must not talk too much. He must not forget that he was ill. He must not forget that he was very easily tired. Mary thought that there seemed to be a number of uncomfortable things he was not to forget. Colin looked fretful and kept his strange black-lashed eyes fixed on Dr. Craven's face. "I want to forget it," he said at last. "She makes me forget it. That is why I want her." Dr. Craven did not look happy when he left the room. He gave a puzzled glance at the little girl sitting on the large footstool. She had become a stiff, silent child again as soon as he entered, and he could not see what the attraction was. The boy actually did look brighter, however, and he sighed rather heavily as he went down the corridor. "They're always wanting me to eat things when I don't want to," said Colin as the nurse brought in the tea and put it on the table by the sofa. "Now if you'll eat, I will. Those muffins look so nice and hot. Tell me about Rajah's." End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Secret Garden. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Karen Savage. The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 15. Nest Building. After another week of rain, the high arch of blue sky appeared again, and the sun which poured down was quite hot. Though there had been no chance to see either the secret garden nor Dickon, Mistress Mary had enjoyed herself very much. The week had not seemed long. She had spent hours of every day with Colin in his room, talking about Rajahs or gardens or Dickon and the cottage on the moor. They had looked at the splendid books and pictures, and sometimes Mary had read things to Colin, and sometimes he had read a little to her. When he was amused and interested, she thought he scarcely looked like an invalid at all, except that his face was so colourless, and he was always on the sofa. "You are a sly young one to listen and get out of your bed and go following things up like you did that night," Mrs. Medlock said once. "But there's no saying it's not been a sort of blessing to the lot of us. He's not had a tantrum or a whining fit since you made friends. The nurse was just going to give up the case because she was so sick of him, but she says she doesn't mind staying now you've gone on duty with her," laughing a little. In her talks with Colin, Mary had tried to be very cautious about the secret garden. There were certain things she wanted to find out from him, but she felt that she must find them out without asking him direct questions. In the first place, as she began to like to be with him, she wanted to discover whether he was the kind of boy you could tell a secret to. He was not in the least like Dickon, but he was evidently so pleased with the idea of a garden no one knew anything about that she thought perhaps he could be trusted. But she had not known him long enough to be sure. The second thing she wanted to find out was this: if he could be trusted, if he really could, wouldn't it be possible to take him to the garden without having anyone find it out? The Grand Doctor had said that he must have fresh air, and Colin had said that he would not mind fresh air in a secret garden. Perhaps if he had a great deal of fresh air, and knew Dickon and the robin and saw things growing, he might not think so much about dying. Mary had seen herself in the glass sometimes lately, when she had realized that she looked quite a different creature from the child she had seen when she arrived from India. This child looked nicer. Even Martha had seen a change in her. "There from the moor has done thee good already," she had said. "Thou'rt not nigh so yeller, and thou'rt not nigh so scrawny. Even thy hair doesn't slamp down on thy head so flat. It's got some life in it, so's it sticks out a bit." "It's like me," said Mary. "It's growing stronger and fatter. I'm sure there's more of it." "It looks it for sure," said Martha, ruffling it up a little round her face. "Thou'rt not half so ugly when it's that way, and there's a bit of red in thy cheeks." If gardens and fresh air had been good for her, perhaps they would be good for Colin. But then if he hated people to look at him, perhaps he would not like to see Dickon. "Why does it make you angry when you're looked at?" she inquired one day. "I always hated it," he answered, "even when I was very little. Then when they took me to the seaside and I used to lie in my carriage, everybody used to stare and ladies would stop and talk to my nurse, and then they would begin to whisper, and I knew then they were saying I shouldn't live to grow up. Then sometimes the lady would pat my cheeks and say, 'Poor child.' Once when a lady did that, I screamed out loud and bit her hand. She was so frightened she ran away." "She thought you had gone mad like a dog," said Mary, not at all admiringly. "I don't care what she thought," said Colin, frowning. "I wonder why you didn't scream and bite me when I came into your room," said Mary. Then she began to smile slowly. "I thought you were a ghost or a dream," he said. "You can't bite a ghost or a dream, and if you scream they don't care." "Would you hate it if a boy looked at you?" Mary asked uncertainly. He lay back on his cushion and paused thoughtfully. "There's one boy," he said quite slowly, as if he were thinking over every word. "There's one boy I believe I shouldn't mind. It's that boy who knows where the foxes live, Dickon." "I'm sure you wouldn't mind him," said Mary. "The birds don't, and other animals," he said, still thinking it over. "Perhaps that's why I shouldn't. He's a sort of animal charmer, and I'm a boy animal." Then he laughed, and she laughed too. In fact, it ended in their both laughing a great deal and finding the idea of a boy animal hiding in his hole very funny indeed. What Mary felt afterward was that she need not fear about Dickon. On that first morning when the sky was blue again, Mary wakened very early. The sun was pouring in slanting rays through the blinds, and there was something so joyous in the sight of it that she jumped out of bed and ran to the window. She drew up the blinds and opened the window itself, and a great waft of fresh scented air blew in upon her. The moor was blue, and the whole world looked as if some magic had happened to it. There were tender little fluting sounds here and there and everywhere, as if scores of birds were beginning to tune up for a concert. Mary put her hand out of the window and held it in the sun. "It's warm, warm," she said. "It will make the green points push up and up and up, and they will make the bulbs and roots work and struggle with all their might under the earth." She kneeled down and leaned out of the window as far as she could, breathing big breaths and sniffing the air until she laughed because she remembered what Dickon's mother had said about the end of his nose quivering like a rabbit's. "It must be very early," she said. "The little clouds are all pink, and I've never seen the sky look like this. No one is up. I don't even hear the stable boys." A sudden thought made her scramble to her feet. "I can't wait. I'm going to see the garden." She had learned to dress herself by this time, and she put on her clothes in 5 minutes. She knew a small side door which she could unbolt herself, and she flew downstairs in her stocking feet and put on her shoes in the hall. She unchained and unbolted and unlocked, and when the door was open, she sprang across the step with one bound, and there she was, standing on the grass, which seemed to have turned green, and with the sun pouring down on her, and warm, sweet wafts about her, and the fluting and twittering and singing coming from every bush and tree. She clasped her hands for pure joy, and looked up in the sky, and it was so blue and pink and pearly and white and flooded with springtime light that she felt as if she must flute and sing aloud herself, and knew that thrushes and robins and skylarks could not possibly help it. She ran around the shrubs and paths towards the secret garden. "It is all different already," she said. "The grass is greener, and things are sticking up everywhere, and things are uncurling, and green buds of leaves are showing. This afternoon I am sure Dickon will come." The long, warm rain had done strange things to the herbaceous beds which bordered the walk by the lower wall. There were things sprouting and pushing out from the roots of clumps of plants, and there were actually here and there glimpses of royal purple and yellow unfurling among the stems of crocuses. 6 months before, Mistress Mary would not have seen how the world was waking up, but now she missed nothing. When she had reached the place where the door hid itself under the ivy, she was startled by a curious, loud sound. It was the caw-caw of a crow, and it came from the top of the wall, and when she looked up, there sat a big, glossy-plumaged, blue-black bird, looking down at her very wisely indeed. She had never seen a crow so close before, and he made her a little nervous. But the next moment he spread his wings and flapped away across the garden. She hoped he was not going to stay inside, and she pushed the door open, wondering if he would. When she got fairly into the garden, she saw that he did probably intend to stay, because he had alighted on a dwarf apple tree, and under the apple tree was lying a little reddish animal with a bushy tail, and both of them were watching the stooping body and rust-red head of Dickon, who was kneeling on the grass, working hard. Mary flew across the grass to him. "Oh, Dickon, Dickon!" she cried out. "How could you get here so early? How could you? The sun has only just got up." He got up himself, laughing and glowing and tousled, his eyes like a bit of the sky. "Eh," he said, "I was up long before him. How could I have stayed abed? The world's all fair begun again this morning, it has. And it's working and humming and scratching and piping and nest building and breathing out scents till you've got to be out in it, instead of lying on your back. When the sun did jump up, the moor went mad for joy, and I was in the midst of the heather and run like mad myself, shouting and singing, and I come straight here. I couldn't have stayed away. Why, the garden was lying here waiting." Mary put her hands on her chest, panting as if she had been running herself. "Oh, Dickon, Dickon," she said, "I'm so happy I can scarcely breathe." Seeing him talking to a stranger, the little bushy-tailed animal rose from its place under the tree and came to him, and the rook, cawing once, flew down from its branch and settled quietly on his shoulder. "This is the little fox cub," he said, rubbing the little reddish animal's head. "It's named Captain. And this here's Soot. Soot, he flew across the moor with me, and Captain, he run the same as if the hounds had been after him. They both felt the same as I did." Neither of the creatures looked as if he were the least afraid of Mary. When Dickon began to walk about, Soot stayed on his shoulder, and Captain trotted quietly close to his side. "See here," said Dickon. "See how these is pushed up, and these, and look at these here." He threw himself upon his knees, and Mary went down beside him. They had come upon a whole clump of crocuses burst into purple and orange and gold. Mary bent her face down and kissed them. "You never kiss a person in that way," she said when she lifted her head. "Flowers are so different." He looked puzzled, but smiled. "Eh," he said, "I've kissed Mother many a time that way when I come in from the moor after a day's roaming, and she stood there in the door in the sun, looking so glad and comfortable." They ran from one part of the garden to another, and found so many wonders that they were obliged to remind themselves that they must whisper or speak low. He showed her swelling leaf buds on rose branches which had seemed dead. He showed her 10,000 new green points pushing through the mould. They put their eager young noses close to the earth and sniffed its warmed springtime breathing. They dug and pulled and laughed low with rapture until Mistress Mary's hair was as tumbled as Dickon's, and her cheeks were almost as poppy red as his. There was every joy on earth in the secret garden that morning, and in the midst of them came a delight more delightful than all, because it was more wonderful. Swiftly something flew across the wall and darted through the trees to a close-grown corner, a little flare of red-breasted bird with something hanging from its beak. Dickon stood quite still and put his hand on Mary, almost as if they had suddenly found themselves laughing in a church. "We munnot stir," he whispered in broad Yorkshire. "We munnot scarce breathe. I knowed he was a mate hunting when I seed him last. It's Ben Weatherstaff's robin. He's building his nest. He'll stay here if us don't fight him." They settled down softly upon the grass and sat there without moving. "Us mustn't seem as if us was watching him too close," said Dickon. "He'd be out with us for good if he got the notion us was interfering now. He'll be a good bit different till all this is over. He's setting up housekeeping. He'll be shyer and readier to take things ill. He's got no time for visiting and gossiping. Us must keep still a bit and try to look as if us was grass and trees and bushes. Then, when he's got used to seeing us, I'll chirp a bit, and he'll know us'll not be in his way." Mistress Mary was not at all sure that she knew, as Dickon seemed to, how to try to look like grass and trees and bushes. But he had said the queer thing as if it were the simplest and most natural thing in the world, and she felt it must be quite easy to him, and indeed she watched him for a few minutes carefully, wondering if it was possible for him to quietly turn green and put out branches and leaves. But he only sat wonderfully still, and when he spoke dropped his voice to such a softness that it was curious that she could hear him. But she could. "It's part of the springtime, this nest-building is," he said. "I warrant it's been going on in the same way every year since the world was begun. They've got their way of thinking and doing things, and a body had better not meddle. You can lose a friend in springtime easier than any other season if you're too curious." "If we talk about him I can't help looking at him," Mary said as softly as possible. "We must talk of something else. There is something I want to tell you." "You'll like it better if us talks of something else," said Dickon. "What is it thou's got to tell me?" "Well, do you know about Colin?" she whispered. He turned his head to look at her. "What does thou know about him?" he asked. "I've seen him. I've been to talk to him every day this week. He wants me to come. He says I'm making him forget about being ill and dying," answered Mary. Dickon looked actually relieved as soon as the surprise died away from his round face. "I'm glad of that," he exclaimed. "I'm right down glad. It makes me easier. I knowed I must say nothing about him, and I don't like having to hide things." "Don't you like hiding the garden?" said Mary. "I'll never tell about it," he answered. "But I says to Mother, 'Mother,' I says, 'I got a secret to keep. It's not a bad un, tha knows that. It's no worse than hiding where a bird's nest is. Tha doesn't mind it, does tha?'" Mary always wanted to hear about Mother. "What did she say?" she asked, not at all afraid to hear. Dickon grinned sweet-temperedly. "It was just like her what she said," he answered. "She give my head a bit of a rub and laughed, and she says, 'Eh, lad, tha can have all the secrets tha likes. I've knowed thee 12 year.'" "How did you know about Colin?" asked Mary. "Everybody as knowed about Mester Craven knowed there was a little lad as was like to be a cripple, and they knowed Mester Craven didn't like him to be talked about. Folks is sorry for Mester Craven because Mrs. Craven was such a pretty young lady, and they was so fond of each other. Mrs. Medlock stops in our cottage whenever she goes to Thwaite, and she doesn't mind talking to Mother before us children, because she knows us has been brought up to be trusty. How did tha find out about him? Martha was in fine trouble the last time she came home. She said tha'd heard him fretting, and thou was asking questions, and she didn't know what to say." Mary told him her story about the midnight wuthering of the wind which had wakened her, and about the faint, far-off sounds of the complaining voice which had led her down the dark corridors with her candle, and had ended with her opening of the door of the dimly lighted room with the carven four-posted bed in the corner. When she described the small ivory-white face and the strange black-rimmed eyes, Dickon shook his head. "Them's just like his mother's eyes, only hers was always laughing, they say," he said. "They say as Mester Craven can't bear to see him when he's awake, and it's because his eyes is so like his mother's, and yet looks so different in his miserable bit of a face." "Do you think he wants to die?" whispered Mary. "No, but he wishes he'd never been born. Mother says that's the worst thing on earth for a child. Them as is not wanted scarce ever thrives. Mester Craven he'd buy anything as money could buy for the poor lad, but he'd like to forget as he's on earth. For one thing, he's afraid he'll look at him some day and find he's growed hunchback." "Colin's so afraid of it himself that he won't sit up," said Mary. "He says he's always thinking that if he should feel a lump coming he should go crazy and scream himself to death." "Eh, he oughtn't to lie there thinking things like that," said Dickon. "No lad could get well as thought them sort of things." The fox was lying on the grass close by him, looking up to ask for a pat now and then, and Dickon bent down and rubbed his neck softly and thought a few minutes in silence. Presently he lifted his head and looked round the garden. "When first we got in here," he said, "it seemed like everything was grey. Look round now and tell me if that doesn't see a difference." Mary looked and caught her breath a little. "Why," she cried, "the grey wall is changing. It's as if a green mist were creeping over it. It's almost like a green gauze veil." "Aye," said Dickon, "and it'll be greener and greener till the grey's all gone. Can tha guess what I was thinking?" "I know it was something nice," said Mary eagerly. "I believe it was something about Colin." "I was thinking that if he was out here he wouldn't be watching for lumps to grow on his back. He'd be watching for buds to break on the rose bushes, and he'd likely be healthier," explained Dickon. "I was wondering if us could ever get him in the humour to come out here and lie under the trees in his carriage." "I've been wondering that myself. I've thought of it almost every time I've talked to him," said Mary. "I've wondered if he could keep a secret, and I've wondered if we could bring him here without anyone seeing us. I thought perhaps you could push his carriage. The doctor said he must have fresh air, and if he wants us to take him out, no one dare disobey him. He won't go out for other people, and perhaps they will be glad if he will go out with us. He could order the gardeners to keep away so they wouldn't find out." Dickon was thinking very hard as he scratched Captain's back. "It'd be good for him, I'll warrant," he said. "Us'd not be thinking he'd better never been born. Us'd be just 2 children watching a garden grow, and he'd be another. 2 lads and a little lass, just looking on at the springtime. I warrant it'd be better than doctor's stuff." "He's been lying in his room so long, and he's always been so afraid of his back that it has made him queer," said Mary. "He knows a good many things out of books, but he doesn't know anything else. He says he has been too ill to notice things, and he hates going out of doors and hates gardens and gardeners. But he likes to hear about this garden because it is a secret. I daren't tell him much, but he said he wanted to see it." "Us'll have him out here some time for sure," said Dickon. "I could push his carriage well enough. Has tha noticed how the robin and his mate has been working while we've been sitting here? Look at him perched on that branch, wondering where it'd be best to put that twig he's got in his beak." He made one of his low whistling calls, and the robin turned his head and looked at him inquiringly, still holding his twig. Dickon spoke to him as Ben Weatherstaff did, but Dickon's tone was one of friendly advice. "Wheresoever thou puts it," he said, "it'll be all right. Thou knew how to build thy nest before thou came out of the egg. Get on with thee, lad. Thou's got no time to lose." "Oh, I do like to hear you talk to him," Mary said, laughing delightedly. "Ben Weatherstaff scolds him and makes fun of him, and he hops about and looks as if he understood every word, and I know he likes it. Ben Weatherstaff says he is so conceited he would rather have stones thrown at him than not be noticed." Dickon laughed too and went on talking. "Tha knows us won't trouble thee," he said to the robin. "Us is near being wild things ourselves. Us is nest building too, bless thee. Look out tha doesn't tell on us." And though the robin did not answer, because his beak was occupied, Mary knew that when he flew away with his twig to his own corner of the garden, the darkness of his dew-bright eye meant that he would not tell their secret for the world. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of The Secret Garden. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Karen Savage. The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 16. "I won't," said Mary. They found a great deal to do that morning, and Mary was late in returning to the house, and was also in such a hurry to get back to her work that she quite forgot Colin until the last moment. "Tell Colin that I can't come and see him yet," she said to Martha. "I'm very busy in the garden." Martha looked rather frightened. "Eh, Miss Mary," she said, "it may put him all out of humour when I tell him that." But Mary was not as afraid of him as other people were, and she was not a self-sacrificing person. "I can't stay," she answered. "Dickon's waiting for me," and she ran away. The afternoon was even lovelier and busier than the morning had been. Already nearly all the weeds were cleared out of the garden, and most of the roses and trees had been pruned or dug about. Dickon had brought a spade of his own, and he had taught Mary to use all her tools, so that by this time it was plain that, though the lovely wild place was not likely to become a gardener's garden, it would be a wilderness of growing things before the springtime was over. "There'll be apple blossoms and cherry blossoms overhead," Dickon said, working away with all his might, "and there'll be peach and plum trees in bloom against the walls, and the grass'll be a carpet of flowers." The little fox and the rook were as happy and busy as they were, and the robin and his mate flew backward and forward like tiny streaks of lightning. Sometimes the rook flapped his black wings and soared away over the tree-tops in the park. Each time he came back and perched near Dickon and cawed several times, as if he were relating his adventures, and Dickon talked to him just as he had talked to the robin. Once, when Dickon was so busy that he did not answer him at first, Soot flew onto his shoulders and gently tweaked his ear with his large beak. When Mary wanted to rest a little, Dickon sat down with her under a tree, and once he took his pipe out of his pocket and played the soft, strange little notes, and 2 squirrels appeared on the wall and looked and listened. "Tha's a good bit stronger than tha was," Dickon said, looking at her as she was digging. "Tha's beginning to look different for sure." Mary was glowing with exercise and good spirits. "I'm getting fatter and fatter every day," she said quite exultantly. "Mrs. Medlock will have to get me some bigger dresses. Martha says my hair is growing thicker. It isn't so flat and stringy." The sun was beginning to set and sending deep gold-colored rays slanting under the trees when they parted. "It'll be fine tomorrow," said Dickon. "I'll be at work by sunrise." "So will I," said Mary. She ran back to the house as quickly as her feet would carry her. She wanted to tell Colin about Dickon's fox cub and the rook, and about what the springtime had been doing. She felt sure he would like to hear. So it was not very pleasant when she opened the door of her room to see Martha standing waiting for her with a doleful face. "What is the matter?" she asked. "What did Colin say when you told him I couldn't come?" "Eh," said Martha, "I wish tha'd gone. He was nigh going into one of his tantrums. There's been a nice to-do all afternoon to keep him quiet. He would watch the clock all the time." Mary's lips pinched themselves together. She was no more used to considering other people than Colin was, and she saw no reason why an ill-tempered boy should interfere with the thing she liked best. She knew nothing about the pitifulness of people who had been ill and nervous, and who did not know that they could control their tempers and need not make other people ill and nervous too. When she had had a headache in India, she had done her best to see that everybody else also had a headache, or something quite as bad. And she felt she was quite right, but of course now she felt that Colin was quite wrong. He was not on his sofa when she went into his room. He was lying flat on his back in bed, and he did not turn his head toward her as she came in. This was a bad beginning, and Mary marched up to him with her stiff manner. "Why didn't you get up?" she said. "I did get up this morning when I thought you were coming," he answered without looking at her. "I made them put me back in bed this afternoon. My back ached and my head ached and I was tired. Why didn't you come?" "I was working in the garden with Dickon," said Mary. Colin frowned and condescended to look at her. "I won't let that boy come here if you go and stay with him instead of coming to talk to me," he said. Mary flew into a fine passion. She could fly into a passion without making a noise. She just grew sour and obstinate and did not care what happened. "If you send Dickon away, I'll never come into this room again," she retorted. "You'll have to if I want you," said Colin. "I won't," said Mary. "I'll make you," said Colin. "They shall drag you in." "Shall they, Mr. Rajah?" said Mary fiercely. "They may drag me in, but they can't make me talk when they get me here. I'll sit and clench my teeth and never tell you one thing. I won't even look at you. I'll stare at the floor." They were a nice, agreeable pair as they glared at each other. If they had been 2 little street boys, they would have sprung at each other and had a rough-and-tumble fight. As it was, they did the next thing to it. "You're a selfish thing!" cried Colin. "What are you?" said Mary. "Selfish people always say that. Anyone is selfish who doesn't do what they want. You're more selfish than I am. You're the most selfish boy I ever saw." "I'm not," snapped Colin. "I'm not as selfish as your fine Dickon is. He keeps you playing in the dirt when he knows I am all by myself. He's selfish, if you like." Mary's eyes flashed fire. "He's nicer than any other boy that ever lived," she said. He's like an angel." It might sound rather silly to say that, but she did not care. "A nice angel!" Colin sneered ferociously. "He's a common cottage boy off the moor." "He's better than a common Rajah," retorted Mary. "He's 1,000 times better." Because she was the stronger of the two, she was beginning to get the better of him. The truth was that he had never had a fight with anyone like himself in his life, and upon the whole it was rather good for him, though neither he nor Mary knew anything about that. He turned his head on his pillow and shut his eyes, and a big tear was squeezed out and ran down his cheek. He was beginning to feel pathetic and sorry for himself, not for anyone else. "I'm not as selfish as you, because I'm always ill, and I'm sure there's a lump coming on my back," he said, "and I'm going to die besides." "You're not," contradicted Mary unsympathetically. He opened his eyes quite wide with indignation. He had never heard such a thing said before. He was at once furious and slightly pleased, if a person could be both at one time. "I'm not," he cried. "I am. You know I am. Everybody says so." "I don't believe it," said Mary sourly. "You just say that to make people sorry. I believe you're proud of it. I don't believe it. If you were a nice boy it might be true, but you're too nasty." In spite of his invalid back, Colin sat up in bed in quite a healthy rage. "Get out of the room!" he shouted, and he caught hold of his pillow and threw it at her. He was not strong enough to throw it far, and it only fell at her feet. But Mary's face looked as pinched as a nutcracker. "I'm going," she said, "and I won't come back." She walked to the door, and when she reached it she turned round and spoke again. "I was going to tell you all sorts of nice things," she said. "Dickon brought his fox and his rook, and I was going to tell you all about them. Now I won't tell you a single thing." She marched out of the door and closed it behind her, and there, to her great astonishment, she found the trained nurse standing as if she had been listening, and more amazing still, she was laughing. She was a big, handsome young woman who ought not to have been a trained nurse at all, as she could not bear invalids, and she was always making excuses to leave Colin to Martha or anyone else who would take her place. Mary had never liked her, and she simply stood and gazed up at her as she stood giggling into her handkerchief. "What are you laughing at?" she asked her. "At you two young ones," said the nurse. "It's the best thing that could have happened to that sickly, pampered thing, to have someone stand up to him that's as spoiled as himself." And she laughed into her handkerchief again. "If he'd had a young vixen of a sister to fight with, it would have been the saving of him." "Is he going to die?" "I don't know and I don't care," said the nurse. "Hysterics and temper are half what ails him." "What are hysterics?" asked Mary. "You'll find out if you work him into a tantrum after this. But at any rate you've given him something to have hysterics about, and I'm glad of it." Mary went back to her room, not feeling at all as she had felt when she had come in from the garden. She was cross and disappointed, but not at all sorry for Colin. She had looked forward to telling him a great many things, and she had meant to try to make up her mind whether it would be safe to trust him with a great secret. She had been beginning to think it would be, but now she had changed her mind entirely. She would never tell him, and he could stay in his room and never get any fresh air and die if he liked. It would serve him right. She felt so sour and unrelenting that for a few minutes she almost forgot about Dickon and the green veil creeping over the world and the soft wind blowing down from the moor. Martha was waiting for her, and the trouble in her face had been temporarily replaced by interest and curiosity. There was a wooden box on the table, and its cover had been removed and revealed that it was full of neat packages. "Mr. Craven sent it to you," said Martha. "It looks as if it had picture books in it." Mary remembered what he had asked her the day she had gone to his room. "Do you want anything? Dolls? Toys? Books?" She opened the package, wondering if he had sent a doll, and also wondering what she should do with it if he had. But he had not sent one. There were several beautiful books such as Colin had, and 2 of them were about gardens and were full of pictures. There were 2 or 3 games, and there was a beautiful little writing case with a gold monogram on it and a gold pen and inkstand. Everything was so nice that her pleasure began to crowd her anger out of her mind. She had not expected him to remember her at all, and her hard little heart grew quite warm. "I can write better than I can print," she said, "and the first thing I shall write with that pen will be a letter to tell him I am much obliged." If she had been friends with Colin, she would have run to show him her presents at once, and they would have looked at the pictures and read some of the gardening books, and perhaps tried playing the games, and he would have enjoyed himself so much he would never once have thought he was going to die, or have put his hand on his spine to see if there was a lump coming. He had a way of doing that which she could not bear. It gave her an uncomfortable, frightened feeling, because he always looked so frightened himself. He said that even if he felt quite a little lump some day, he should know his hunch had begun to grow. Something he had heard Mrs. Medlock whispering to the nurse had given him the idea, and he had thought over it in secret until it was quite firmly fixed in his mind. Mrs. Medlock had said his father's back had begun to show its crookedness in that way when he was a child. He had never told anyone but Mary that most of his tantrums, as they called them, grew out of his hysterical, hidden fear. Mary had been sorry for him when he had told her. "He always began to think about it when he was cross or tired," she said to herself, "and he has been cross today. Perhaps he has been thinking about it all afternoon." She stood still, looking down at the carpet and thinking. "I said I would never go back again," she hesitated, knitting her brows, "but perhaps, just perhaps, I will go and see if he wants me, in the morning." Perhaps he'll try to throw his pillow at me again, but I think I'll go. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of The Secret Garden. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Karen Savage. The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 17. A Tantrum. She had got up very early in the morning and had worked hard in the garden, and she was tired and sleepy, so as soon as Martha had brought her supper and she had eaten it, she was glad to go to bed. As she laid her head on the pillow, she murmured to herself, "I'll go out before breakfast and work with Dickon, and then afterward, I believe I'll go to see him." She thought it was the middle of the night when she was awakened by such dreadful sounds that she jumped out of bed in an instant. What was it? What was it? The next minute she felt quite sure she knew. Doors were opened and shut, and there were hurrying feet in the corridors, and someone was crying and screaming at the same time, screaming and crying in a horrible way. "It's Colin," she said. "He's having one of those tantrums the nurse called hysterics. How awful it sounds!" As she listened to the sobbing screams, she did not wonder that people were so frightened that they gave him his own way in everything rather than hear them. She put her hands over her ears and felt sick and shivering. "I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do," she kept saying. "I can't bear it." Once she wondered if he would stop if she dared go to him, and then she remembered how he had driven her out of the room, and thought that perhaps the sight of her might make him worse. Even when she pressed her hands more tightly over her ears, she could not keep the awful sounds out. She hated them so, and was so terrified by them, that suddenly they began to make her angry, and she felt as if she should like to fly into a tantrum herself and frighten him as he was frightening her. She was not used to anyone's tempers but her own. She took her hands from her ears and sprang up and stamped her foot. "He ought to be stopped. Somebody ought to make him stop. Somebody ought to beat him," she cried out. Just then she heard feet almost running down the corridor, and her door opened and the nurse came in. She was not laughing now by any means. She even looked rather pale. "He's worked himself into hysterics," she said in a great hurry. "He'll do himself harm. No one can do anything with him. You come and try like a good child. He likes you." "He turned me out of the room this morning," said Mary, stamping her foot with excitement. The stamp rather pleased the nurse. The truth was that she had been afraid she might find Mary crying and hiding her head under the bedclothes. "That's right," she said. "You're in the right humor. You go and scold him. Give him something new to think of. Do go, child, as quick as ever you can." It was not until afterward that Mary realized that the thing had been funny as well as dreadful. That it was funny that all the grown-up people were so frightened that they came to a little girl, just because they guessed she was almost as bad as Colin himself. She flew along the corridor, and the nearer she got to the screams, the higher her temper mounted. She felt quite wicked by the time she reached the door. She slapped it open with her hand and ran across the room to the four-posted bed. "You stop!" she almost shouted. "You stop! I hate you! Everybody hates you! I wish everybody would run out of the house and let you scream yourself to death! You will scream yourself to death in a minute, and I wish you would!" A nice, sympathetic child could neither have thought nor said such things, but it just happened that the shock of hearing them was the best possible thing for this hysterical boy whom no one had ever dared to restrain or contradict. He had been lying on his face, beating his pillow with his hands, and he actually almost jumped around, he turned so quickly at the sound of the furious little voice. His face looked dreadful, white and red and swollen, and he was gasping and choking, but savage little Mary did not care an atom. "If you scream another scream," she said, "I'll scream too, and I can scream louder than you can, and I'll frighten you! I'll frighten you!" He actually had stopped screaming because she had startled him so. The scream which had been coming almost choked him. The tears were streaming down his face and he shook all over. "I can't stop," he gasped and stopped. I can't." "You can!" shouted Mary. "Half that ails you is hysterics and temper. Just hysterics, hysterics, hysterics!" And she stamped each time she said it. "I felt the lump. I felt it," choked out Colin. "I knew I should. I shall have a hunch on my back, and then I shall die." And he began to writhe again and turned on his face and sobbed and wailed, but he didn't scream. "You didn't feel a lump," contradicted Mary fiercely. "If you did, it was only a hysterical lump. Hysterics makes lumps. There's nothing the matter with your horrid back, nothing but hysterics. Turn over and let me look at it." She liked the word hysterics, and felt somehow as if it had an effect on him. He was probably like herself and had never heard it before. "Nurse," she commanded, "come here and show me his back this minute." The nurse, Mrs. Medlock, and Martha had been standing huddled together near the door, staring at her, their mouths half open. All three had gasped with fright more than once. The nurse came forward as if she were half afraid. Colin was heaving great, breathless sobs. "Perhaps he won't let me," she hesitated in a low voice. Colin heard her, however, and he gasped out between two sobs, "Show her! She'll see then." It was a poor, thin back to look at when it was bared. Every rib could be counted, and every joint of the spine, though Mistress Mary did not count them as she bent over and examined them with a solemn, savage little face. She looked so sour and old-fashioned that the nurse turned her head aside to hide the twitching of her mouth. There was just a minute's silence, for even Colin tried to hold his breath, while Mary looked up and down his spine and down and up, as intently as if she had been the great doctor from London. "There's not a single lump there," she said at last. "There's not a lump as big as a pin, except backbone lumps, and you can only feel them because you're thin. I've got backbone lumps myself, and they used to stick out as much as yours do, until I began to get fatter, and I'm not fat enough yet to hide them. There's not a lump as big as a pin. If you ever say there is again, I shall laugh." No one but Colin himself knew what effect those crossly spoken childish words had on him. If he had ever had anyone to talk to about his secret terrors, if he had ever dared to let himself ask questions, if he had had childish companions and had not lain on his back in the huge closed house, breathing an atmosphere heavy with the fears of people who were most of them ignorant and tired of him, he would have found out that most of his fright and illness was created by himself. But he had lain and thought of himself and his aches and weariness for hours and days and months and years. And now that an angry, unsympathetic little girl insisted obstinately that he was not as ill as he thought he was, he actually felt as if she might be speaking the truth. "I didn't know," ventured the nurse, "that he thought he had a lump on his spine. His back is weak because he won't try to sit up. I could have told him there was no lump there." Colin gulped and turned his face a little to look at her. "Could you?" he said pathetically. "Yes, sir." "There," said Mary, and she gulped too. Colin turned on his face again, and but for his long-drawn broken breaths, which were the dying down of his storm of sobbing, he lay still for a minute, though great tears streamed down his face and wet the pillow. Actually, the tears meant that a curious great relief had come to him. Presently he turned and looked at the nurse again, and strangely enough, he was not like a Rajah at all as he spoke to her. "Do you think I could live to grow up?" he said. The nurse was neither clever nor soft-hearted, but she could repeat some of the London doctor's words. "You probably will if you do what you are told to do and not give way to your temper and stay out a great deal in the fresh air." Colin's tantrum had passed, and he was weak and worn out with crying, and this perhaps made him feel gentle. He put out his hand a little toward Mary, and I am glad to say that, her own tantrum having passed, she was softened too, and met him halfway with her hand, so that it was a sort of making up. I'll go out with you, Mary," he said. "I shan't hate fresh air if we can find—" He remembered just in time to stop himself from saying, "if we can find the secret garden," and he ended, "I shall like to go out with you if Dickon will come and push my chair. I do so want to see Dickon and the fox and the crow." The nurse remade the tumbled bed and shook and straightened the pillows. Then she made Colin a cup of beef tea and gave a cup to Mary, who really was very glad to get it after her excitement. Mrs. Medlock and Martha gladly slipped away, and after everything was neat and calm and in order, the nurse looked as if she would very gladly slip away also. She was a healthy young woman who resented being robbed of her sleep, and she yawned quite openly as she looked at Mary, who had pushed her big footstool close to the four-posted bed and was holding Colin's hand. "You must go back and get your sleep out," she said. "He'll drop off after a while, if he's not too upset. Then I'll lie down myself in the next room." "Would you like me to sing you that song I learned from my ayah?" Mary whispered to Colin. His hand pulled hers gently, and he turned his tired eyes on her appealingly. "Oh, yes," he answered. "It's such a soft song. I shall go to sleep in a minute." "I will put him to sleep," Mary said to the yawning nurse. "You can go if you like." "Well," said the nurse with an attempt at reluctance, If he doesn't go to sleep in half an hour, you must call me." "Very well," answered Mary. The nurse was out of the room in a minute, and as soon as she was gone, Colin pulled Mary's hand again. "I almost told," he said, "but I stopped myself in time. I won't talk, and I'll go to sleep, but you said you had a whole lot of nice things to tell me. Do you think you have found out anything at all about the way into the secret garden?" Mary looked at his poor little tired face and swollen eyes, and her heart relented. "Yes," she answered, "I think I have. And if you will go to sleep, I will tell you tomorrow." His hand quite trembled. "Oh, Mary," he said, "oh, Mary, if I could get into it, I think I should live to grow up. Do you suppose that instead of singing the Ayah song, you could just tell me softly as you did that first day what you imagine it looks like inside? I'm sure it will make me go to sleep." "Yes," answered Mary. "Shut your eyes." He closed his eyes and lay quite still, and she held his hand and began to speak very slowly and in a very low voice. "I think it has been left alone so long that it has grown all into a lovely tangle. I think the roses have climbed and climbed and climbed until they hang from the branches and walls and creep over the ground, almost like a strange grey mist. Some of them have died, but many are alive, and when the summer comes there will be curtains and fountains of roses. I think the ground is full of daffodils and snowdrops and lilies and iris, working their way out of the dark. Now the spring has begun, perhaps— The soft drone of her voice was making him stiller and stiller, and she saw it and went on. "Perhaps they are coming up through the grass. Perhaps there are clusters of purple crocuses and gold ones even now. Perhaps the leaves are beginning to break out and uncurl, and perhaps the grey is changing and a green gauze veil is creeping and creeping over everything, and the birds are coming to look at it because it is so safe and still. And perhaps, very softly and slowly indeed, the robin has found a mate and is building a nest." And Colin was asleep. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The Secret Garden. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Karen Savage. The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 18. Thou Munnot Waste No Time. Of course Mary did not awaken early the next morning. She slept late because she was tired, and when Martha brought her breakfast she told her that though Colin was quite quiet, he was ill and feverish, as he always was after he had worn himself out with a fit of crying. Mary ate her breakfast slowly as she listened. "He says he wishes thou would please go and see him as soon as thou can," Martha says. "It's queer what a fancy he's took to thee. Thou did give it him last night for sure, didn't thou? Nobody else would have dared to do it. Eh, poor lad, he's been spoiled till salt won't save him. Mother says as the two worst things as can happen to a child is never to have his own way or always to have it. She doesn't know which is the worst. Thou was in a fine temper thyself too. But he says to me when I went into his room, 'Please ask Miss Mary if she'll please come and talk to me.' Think o' him saying please. Will you go, miss?" "I'll run and see Dickon first," said Mary. "No, I'll go and see Colin first and tell him— I know what I'll tell him," with a sudden inspiration. She had her hat on when she appeared in Colin's room, and for a second he looked disappointed. He was in bed. His face was pitifully white, and there were dark circles round his eyes. "I'm glad you came," he said. "My head aches, and I ache all over because I'm so tired. Are you going somewhere?" Mary went and leaned against his bed. "I won't be long," she said. "I'm going to Dickon, but I'll come back. Colin, it's something about the garden." His whole face brightened, and a little colour came into it. "Oh, is it?" he cried out. "I dreamed about it all night. I heard you say something about grey changing into green, and I dreamed I was standing in a place all filled with trembling little green leaves, and there were birds on nests everywhere, and they looked so soft and still. I'll lie and think about it until you come back." In 5 minutes Mary was with Dickon in their garden. The fox and the crow were with him again, and this time he had brought 2 tame squirrels. "I came over on the pony this morning," he said. He is a good little chap, Jump is. I brought these 2 in my pockets. This here one is called Nut, and this here other one is called Shell." When he said nut, one squirrel leaped onto his right shoulder, and when he said shell, the other one leaped onto his left shoulder. When they sat down on the grass with Captain curled at their feet, Soot solemnly listening on a tree, and Nut and Shell nosing close about them, it seemed to Mary that it would be scarcely bearable to leave such delightfulness. But when she began to tell her story, somehow the look in Dickon's funny face gradually changed her mind. She could see he felt sorrier for Colin than she did. He looked up at the sky and all about him. "Just listen to them birds. The world seems full of 'em, all whistling and piping," he said. "Look at 'em darting about, and hearken at 'em calling to each other. Come springtime seems like as if all the world's calling. The leaves is uncurling so you can see 'em, and my word, the nice smell there is about," sniffing with his happy turned-up nose. "And that poor lad lying shut up and seeing so little that he gets to thinking of things that sets him screaming. Eh, my, we mun get him out here. We mun get him watching and listening and sniffing up the air, and get him just soaked through with sunshine. And we munnot lose no time about it." When he was very much interested, he often spoke quite broad Yorkshire, though at other times he tried to modify his dialect so that Mary could better understand. But she loved his broad Yorkshire, and had in fact been trying to learn to speak it herself. So she spoke a little now. "Aye, that we mun," she said, which meant, "Yes, indeed we must." "I'll tell thee what us'll do first," she proceeded, and Dickon grinned, because when the little wench tried to twist her tongue into speaking Yorkshire it amused him very much. "He's took a greatly fancy to thee. He wants to see thee, and he wants to see Soot and Captain. When I go back to the house to talk to him, I'll ax him if tha canna come and see him tomorrow morning, and bring tha creatures with thee, and then, in a bit, when there's more leaves out, and happen a bud or two, we'll get him to come out, and tha shall push him in his chair, and we'll bring him here and show him everything." When she stopped she was quite proud of herself. She had never made a long speech in Yorkshire before, and she had remembered very well. "Thou mun talk a bit o' Yorkshire like that to Mr. Colin," Dickon chuckled. "Tha'll make him laugh, and there's nowt as good for ill folk as laughing is. Mother says as she believes as half a hour's good laugh every morning 'ud cure a chap as was making ready for typhus fever." "I'm going to talk Yorkshire to him this very day," said Mary, chuckling herself. The garden had reached the time when every day and every night it seemed as if magicians were passing through it, drawing loveliness out of the earth and the boughs with wands. It was hard to go away and leave it all, particularly as Nut had actually crept onto her dress, and Shell had scrambled down the trunk of the apple tree they sat under, and stayed there looking at her with inquiring eyes. But she went back to the house, and when she sat down close to Colin's bed, he began to sniff as Dickon did, though not in such an experienced way. "You smell like flowers and fresh things," he cried out quite joyously. "What is it you smell of? It's cool and warm and sweet all at the same time." "It's the wind from the moor," said Mary. "It comes o' sitting on the grass under a tree with Dickon and with Captain and Soot and Nut and Shell. It's the springtime and out of doors and sunshine as smells so greatly." She said it as broadly as she could, and you do not know how broadly Yorkshire sounds until you have heard someone speak it. Colin began to laugh. "What are you doing?" he said. "I never heard you talk like that before. How funny it sounds." "I'm giving thee a bit of Yorkshire," answered Mary triumphantly. "I canna talk as greatly as Dickon and Martha, but tha can see as I can shape a bit. Doesn't tha understand a bit of Yorkshire when tha hears it? And tha, Yorkshire lad thysel, born and bred? Eh, I wonder tha'rt not ashamed of thy face." And then she began to laugh too, and they both laughed until they could not stop themselves, and they laughed until the room echoed, and Mrs. Medlock, opening the door to come in, drew back into the corridor and stood listening amazed. "Well, upon my word," she said, speaking rather broad Yorkshire herself because there was no one to hear her, and she was so astonished. "Whoever heard the like? Whoever on earth would have thought it?" There was so much to talk about. It seemed as if Colin could never hear enough of Dickon and Captain and Soot and Nut and Shell and the pony whose name was Jump. Mary had run round into the wood with Dickon to see Jump. He was a tiny little shaggy moor pony with thick locks hanging over his eyes, and with a pretty face and a nuzzling velvet nose. He was rather thin with living on moor grass, but he was as tough and wiry as if the muscle in his little legs had been made of steel springs. He had lifted his head and whinnied softly the moment he saw Dickon, and he had trotted up to him and put his head across his shoulder, and then Dickon had talked into his ear, and Jump had talked back in odd little whinnies and puffs and snorts. Dickon had made him give Mary his small front hoof, and kiss her on her cheek with his velvet muzzle. "Does he really understand everything Dickon says?" Colin asked. "It seems as if he does," answered Mary. "Dickon says anything will understand if you're friends with it for sure, but you have to be friends for sure." Colin lay quiet a little while, and his strange grey eyes seemed to be staring at the wall, but Mary saw he was thinking. "I wish I was friends with things," he said at last, "but I'm not. I never had anything to be friends with, and I can't bear people." "Can't you bear me?" asked Mary. "Yes, I can," he answered. "It's funny, but I even like you." "Ben Weatherstaff said I was like him," said Mary. "He said he'd warrant we'd both got the same nasty tempers. I think you're like him too. We're all three alike, you and I and Ben Weatherstaff. He said we were neither of us much to look at, and we were as sour as we looked. But I don't feel as sour as I used to before I knew the Robin and Dickon." "Did you feel as if you hated people?" "Yes," answered Mary without affectation. "I should have detested you if I had seen you before I saw the Robin and Dickon." Colin put out his thin hand and touched her. "Mary," he said, "I wish I hadn't said what I did about sending Dickon away. I hated you when you said he was like an angel, and I laughed at you, but perhaps he is." "Well, it was rather funny to say it," she admitted frankly, "because his nose does turn up, and he has a big mouth, and his clothes have patches all over them, and he talks broad Yorkshire. But if an angel did come to Yorkshire and live on the moor, if there was a Yorkshire angel, I believe he'd understand the green things, and know how to make them grow, and he would know how to talk to the wild creatures as Dickon does, and they'd know he was friends for sure." "I shouldn't mind Dickon looking at me," said Colin. "I want to see him." "I'm glad you said that," answered Mary, because... Quite suddenly it came into her mind that this was the minute to tell him. Colin knew something new was coming. "Because what?" he cried eagerly. Mary was so anxious that she got up from her stool and came to him and caught hold of both his hands. "Can I trust you? I trusted Dickon because Bert's trusted him. Can I trust you for sure? For sure?" she implored. Her face was so solemn that he almost whispered his answer. "Yes! Yes!" "Well, Dickon will come to see you tomorrow morning, and he'll bring his creatures with him." "Oh! Oh!" cried Colin out in delight. "But that's not all," Mary went on, almost pale with solemn excitement. "The rest is better. There is a door into the garden. I found it. It is under the ivy on the wall." If he had been a strong, healthy boy, Colin would probably have shouted, "Hooray! Hooray! Hooray!" But he was weak and rather hysterical. His eyes grew bigger and bigger, and he gasped for breath. "Oh, Mary!" he cried out with half a sob. "Shall I see it? Shall I get into it? Shall I live to get into it?" And he clutched her hands and dragged her toward him. "Of course you'll see it," snapped Mary indignantly. "Of course you'll live to get into it. Don't be silly." And she was so unhysterical and natural and childish that she brought him to his senses, and he began to laugh at himself, and a few minutes afterward she was sitting on her stool again, telling him not what she imagined the secret garden to be like, but what it really was, and Colin's aches and tiredness were forgotten, and he was listening enraptured. "It is just what you thought it would be," he said at last. "It sounds just as if you had really seen it. You know I said that when you told me first." Mary hesitated about 2 minutes, and then boldly spoke the truth. "I had seen it, and I'd been in," she said. "I found the key and got in weeks ago. But I daren't tell you. I daren't because I was so afraid I couldn't trust you for sure." End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Secret Garden. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Karen Savage. The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 19. It Has Come. Of course Dr. Craven had been sent for the morning after Colin had had his tantrum. He was always sent for at once when such a thing occurred, and he always found, when he arrived, a white, shaken boy lying on his bed, sulky and still so hysterical that he was ready to break into fresh sobbing at the least word. In fact, Dr. Craven dreaded and detested the difficulties of these visits. On this occasion he was away from Misselthwaite Manor until afternoon. "How is he?" he asked Mrs. Medlock rather irritably when he arrived. "He will break a blood vessel in one of those fits some day. The boy is half insane with hysteria and self-indulgence." "Well, sir," answered Mrs. Medlock, "you'll scarcely believe your eyes when you see him. That plain, sour-faced child that's almost as bad as himself has just bewitched him. How she's done it there's no telling. The Lord knows she's nothing to look at, and you scarcely ever hear her speak. But she did what none of us dared do. She just flew at him like a little cat last night, and stamped her feet and ordered him to stop screaming, and somehow she startled him so that he actually did stop. And this afternoon, well, just come up and see, sir. It's past crediting." The scene which Dr. Craven beheld when he entered his patient's room was indeed rather astonishing to him. As Mrs. Medlock opened the door, he heard laughing and chattering. Colin was on his sofa in his dressing gown, and he was sitting up quite straight, looking at a picture in one of the garden books, and talking to the plain child, who at that moment could scarcely be called plain at all, because her face was so glowing with enjoyment. "Those long spires of blue ones, we'll have a lot of those," Colin was announcing. "They're called delphiniums." "Dickon says they're larkspurs made big and grand," cried Mistress Mary. "There are clumps there already." Then they saw Dr. Craven and stopped. Mary became quite still, and Colin looked fretful. "I am sorry to hear you were ill last night, my boy," Dr. Craven said a trifle nervously. He was rather a nervous man. "I am better now, much better," Colin answered, rather like a Rajah. "I am going out in my chair in a day or two, if it is fine. I want some fresh air." Dr. Craven sat down by him and felt his pulse, and looked at him curiously. "It must be a very fine day," he said, "and you must be very careful not to tire yourself." "Fresh air won't tire me," said the young Rajah. As there had been occasions when this same young gentleman had shrieked aloud with rage, and had insisted that fresh air would give him cold and kill him, it is not to be wondered at that his doctor felt somewhat startled. "I thought you did not like fresh air," he said. "I don't when I am by myself," replied the Rajah, "but my cousin is going out with me." "And the nurse, of course," suggested Dr. Craven. "No, I will not have the nurse," so magnificently that Mary could not help remembering how the young native prince had looked with his diamonds and emeralds and pearls stuck all over him, and the great rubies on the small dark hand he had waved to command his servants to approach with salams and receive his orders. "My cousin knows how to take care of me. I am always better when she is with me. She made me better last night. A very strong boy I know will push my carriage." Dr. Craven felt rather alarmed. If this tiresome hysterical boy should chance to get well, he himself would lose all chance of inheriting Misselthwaite. But he was not an unscrupulous man, though he was a weak one, and he did not intend to let him run into actual danger. "He must be a strong and a steady boy," he said, "and I must know something about him. Who is he? What is his name?" "It's Dickon," Mary spoke up suddenly. She felt somehow that everybody who knew the moor must know Dickon, and she was right, too. She saw that in a moment Dr. Craven's serious face relaxed into a relieved smile. "Oh, Dickon," he said. "If it is Dickon, you will be safe enough. He's as strong as a moor pony, is Dickon." "And he's trusty," said Mary. "He's the trustiest lad of Yorkshire." She had been talking Yorkshire to Colin, and she forgot herself. "Did Dickon teach you that?" asked Dr. Craven, laughing outright. "I'm learning it as if it was French," said Mary rather coldly. "It's like a native dialect in India. Very clever people try to learn them. I like it, and so does Colin." "Well, well," he said, "if it amuses you, perhaps it won't do you any harm. Did you take your bromide last night, Colin?" "No," Colin answered. "I wouldn't take it at first, and after Mary made me quiet she talked me to sleep in a low voice about the spring creeping into a garden." "That sounds soothing," said Dr. Craven, more perplexed than ever, and glancing sideways at Mistress Mary sitting on her stool and looking down silently at the carpet. "You are evidently better, but you must remember—" "I don't want to remember," interrupted the Rajah, appearing again. "When I lie by myself and remember, I begin to have pains everywhere, and I think of things that make me begin to scream because I hate them so. If there was a doctor anywhere who could make you forget you were ill instead of remembering it, I would have him brought here," and he waved a thin hand which ought really to have been covered with royal signet rings made of rubies. "It is because my cousin makes me forget that she makes me better." Dr. Craven had never made such a short stay after a tantrum. Usually he was obliged to remain a very long time, and do a great many things. This afternoon he did not give any medicine, or leave any new orders, and he was spared any disagreeable scenes. When he went downstairs he looked very thoughtful, and when he talked to Mrs. Medlock in the library, she felt that he was a much puzzled man. "Well, sir," she ventured, "could you have believed it?" "It is certainly a new state of affairs," said the doctor. "I believe Susan Sowerby's right. I do that," said Mrs. Medlock. "I stopped in her cottage on my way to Thwaite yesterday, and had a bit of talk with her, and she says to me, 'Well, Sarah Ann, she mayn't be a good child, and she mayn't be a pretty one, but she's a child, and children needs children.' We went to school together, Susan Sowerby and me." "She's the best sick nurse I know," said Dr. Craven, When I find her in a cottage, I know the chances are that I shall save my patient." Mrs. Medlock smiled. She was fond of Susan Sowerby. "She's got a way with her, has Susan," she went on quite volubly. "I've been thinking all morning of one thing she said yesterday. She says, 'Once when I was giving the children a bit of preach after they'd been fighting, I says to them all, where I was at school, my geography told us the world was shaped like an orange, and I found out before I was 10 that the whole orange doesn't belong to nobody. No one owns more than his bit of a quarter, and there's times it seems like there's not enough quarters to go round. But don't you, none of you, think as you own the whole orange, or you'll find out you're mistaken, and you won't find it out without hard knocks. What children learns from children,' she says, 'is that there's no sense in grabbing at the whole orange, peel and all. If you do, you'll likely not even get the pips, and them's too bitter to eat.'" "She's a shrewd woman," said Dr. Craven, putting on his coat. "Well, she's got a way of saying things," ended Mrs. Medlock, much pleased. "Sometimes I've said to her, Susan, if you was a different woman and didn't talk such broad Yorkshire, I've seen the times when I should have said you was clever." That night Colin slept without once awakening, and when he opened his eyes in the morning, he lay still and smiled without knowing it. Smiled because he felt so curiously comfortable. It was actually nice to be awake, and he turned over and stretched his limbs luxuriously. He felt as if tight strings which had held him had loosened themselves and let him go. He did not know that Dr. Craven would have said that his nerves had relaxed and rested themselves. Instead of lying and staring at the wall and wishing he had not awakened, his mind was full of the plans he and Mary had made yesterday, of pictures of the garden and of Dickon and his wild creatures. It was so nice to have things to think about. And he had not been awake more than 10 minutes when he heard feet running along the corridor, and Mary was at the door. The next minute she was in the room and had run across to his bed, bringing with her a waft of fresh air full of the scent of the morning. "You've been out! You've been out! There's that nice smell of leaves!" he cried. She had been running, and her hair was loose and blown, and she was bright with the air and pink-cheeked, though he could not see it. "It's so beautiful," she said, a little breathless with her speed. "You never saw anything so beautiful. It has come. I thought it had come that other morning, but it was only coming. It is here now. It has come. The spring. Dickon says so." "Has it?" cried Colin, and though he really knew nothing about it, he felt his heart beat. He actually sat up in bed. "Open the window," he added, laughing half with joyful excitement and half at his own fancy. "Perhaps we may hear golden trumpets." And though he laughed, Mary was at the window in a moment, and in a moment more it was opened wide, and freshness and softness and scents and bird songs were pouring through. "That's fresh air," she said. "Lie on your back and draw in long breaths of it. That's what Dickon does when he's lying on the moor. He says he feels it in his veins, and it makes him strong, and he feels as if he could live forever and ever. Breathe it and breathe it." She was only repeating what Dickon had told her, but she caught Colin's fancy. "Forever and ever. Does it make him feel like that?" he said, and he did as she told him, drawing in long, deep breaths over and over again, until he felt something quite new and delightful was happening to him. Mary was at his bedside again. "Things are crowding up out of the earth," she ran on in a hurry, "and there are flowers uncurling and buds on everything, and the green veil has covered nearly all the grey, and the birds are in such a hurry about their nests for fear they may be too late that some of them are even fighting for places in the secret garden. And the rose bushes look as wick can be, and there are primroses in the lanes and woods, and the seeds we planted are up, and Dickon has brought the fox and the crow and the squirrels and a newborn lamb." And then she paused for breath. The newborn lamb Dickon had found 3 days before lying by its dead mother among the gorse bushes on the moor. It was not the first motherless lamb he had found, and he knew what to do with it. He had taken it to the cottage wrapped in his jacket, and he had let it lie near the fire, and had fed it with warm milk. It was a soft thing with a darling, silly baby face, and legs rather long for its body. Dickon had carried it over the moor in his arms, and its feeding bottle was in his pocket with a squirrel. And when Mary had sat under a tree with its limp warmness huddled on her lap, she had felt as if she were too full of strange joy to speak. A lamb! A lamb! A living lamb who lay on your lap like a baby! She was describing it with great joy, and Colin was listening and drawing in long breaths of air when the nurse entered. She started a little at the sight of the open window. She had sat stifling in the room many a warm day because her patient was sure that open windows gave people cold. "Are you sure you're not chilly, Master Colin?" she inquired. "No," was the answer. "I am breathing long breaths of fresh air. It makes you strong. I am going to get up to the sofa for breakfast. My cousin will have breakfast with me." The nurse went away, concealing a smile, to give the order for 2 breakfasts. She found the servants' hall a more amusing place than the invalid's chamber, and just now everybody wanted to hear the news from upstairs. There was a great deal of joking about the unpopular young recluse who, as the cook said, had found his master and good for him. The servants' hall had been very tired of the tantrums, and the butler, who was a man with a family, had more than once expressed his opinion that the invalid would be all the better for a good hiding. When Colin was on his sofa and the breakfast for 2 was put upon the table, he made an announcement to the nurse in his most Rajah-like manner. "A boy and a fox and a crow and 2 squirrels and a new-born lamb are coming to see me this morning. I want them brought upstairs as soon as they come," he said. "You are not to begin playing with the animals in the servants' hall and keep them there. I want them here." The nurse gave a slight gasp and tried to conceal it with a cough. "Yes, sir," she answered. "I'll tell you what you can do," added Colin, waving his hand. "You can tell Martha to bring them here. The boy is Martha's brother. His name is Dickon, and he is an animal charmer." "I hope the animals won't bite, Master Colin," said the nurse. "I told you he was a charmer," said Colin austerely. "Charmers' animals never bite." "There are snake charmers in India," said Mary, "and they can put their snakes' heads in their mouths." "Goodness!" shuddered the nurse. They ate their breakfast with the morning air pouring in upon them. Colin's breakfast was a very good one, and Mary watched him with serious interest. "You will begin to get fatter just as I did," she said. "I never wanted my breakfast when I was in India, and now I always wanted." "I wanted mine this morning," said Colin. "Perhaps it was the fresh air. When do you think Dickon will come?" He was not long in coming. In about 10 minutes Mary held up her hand. "Listen," she said. "Did you hear a call?" Colin listened and heard it. The oddest sound in the world to hear inside a house, a hoarse caw caw. "Yes," he answered. "That's Soot," said Mary. "Listen again. Do you hear a bleat, a tiny one?" "Oh, yes," cried Colin, quite flushing. "That's the newborn lamb," said Mary. "He's coming." Dickon's moorland boots were thick and clumsy, and though he tried to walk quietly, they made a clumping sound as he walked through the long corridors. Mary and Colin heard him marching, marching, until he passed through the tapestry door onto the soft carpet of Colin's own passage. "If you please, sir," announced Martha, opening the door. "If you please, sir, here's Dickon and his creatures." Dickon came in smiling his nicest wide smile. The newborn lamb was in his arms, and the little red fox trotted by his side. Nut sat on his left shoulder, and Soot on his right, and Shell's head and paws peeped out of his coat pocket. Colin slowly sat up and stared, as he had stared when he first saw Mary, but this was a stare of wonder and delight. The truth was that in spite of all he had heard, he had not in the least understood what this boy would be like, and that his fox and his crow and his squirrels and his lamb were so near to him and his friendliness that they seemed almost to be part of himself. Colin had never talked to a boy in his life, and he was so overwhelmed by his own pleasure and curiosity that he did not even think of speaking. But Dickon did not feel the least shy or awkward. He had not felt embarrassed because the crow had not known his language and had only stared and had not spoken to him the first time they met. Creatures were always like that until they found out about you. He walked over to Colin's sofa and put the newborn lamb quietly on his lap, and immediately the little creature turned to the warm velvet dressing-gown and began to nuzzle and nuzzle into its folds and butt its tight curled head with soft impatience against his side. Of course, no boy could have helped speaking then. "What is it doing?" cried Colin. "What does it want?" "It wants its mother," said Dickon, smiling more and more. "I brought it to thee a bit hungry because I knowed tha'd like to see it feed." He knelt down by the sofa and took a feeding bottle from his pocket. "Come on, little un," he said, turning the small woolly white head with a gentle brown hand. "This is what thou's after. Thou'll get more out of this than thou will out of silk velvet coats. There now," and he pushed the rubber tip of the bottle into the nuzzling mouth, and the lamb began to suck it with ravenous ecstasy. After that there was no wondering what to say. By the time the lamb fell asleep, questions poured forth, and Dickon answered them all. He told them how he had found the lamb just as the sun was rising 3 mornings ago. He had been standing on the moor listening to a skylark and watching him swing higher and higher into the sky until he was only a speck in the heights of blue. "I'd almost lost him but for his song, and I was wondering how a chap could hear it when it seemed as if he'd get out of the world in a minute, and just then I heard something else far off among the gorse bushes. It was a weak bleatin', and I knowed it was a new lamb as was hungry. and I knowed it wouldn't be hungry if it hadn't lost its mother somehow, so I set off searching. I did have a look for it. I went out among the gorse bushes, and round, and I always seemed to take the wrong turning. But at last I seed a bit of white by a rock on top of the moor, and I climbed up, and I found the little un half dead with cold and clemming." While he talked, Soot flew solemnly in and out of the open window and cawed remarks about the scenery, while Nut and Shell made excursions into the big trees outside, and ran up and down trunks and explored branches. Captain curled up near Dickon, who sat on the hearthrug from preference. They looked at the pictures in the gardening books, and Dickon knew all the flowers by their country names, and knew exactly which ones were already growing in the secret garden. "I couldna say that there name," he said, pointing to one under which was written Aquilegia, "but us calls that a columbine, and that there one it's a snapdragon, and they both grow wild in hedges, but these is garden ones, and they're bigger and grander. There's some clumps of columbine in the garden. They'll look like a bed of blue and white butterflies fluttering when they're out." "I'm going to see them," cried Colin. "I am going to see them." "Aye, that tha mun," said Mary quite seriously, "and tha munnot lose no time about it." End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Secret Garden. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Karen Savage. The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 20. I shall live forever and ever and ever. But they were obliged to wait more than a week, because first there came some very windy days, and then Colin was threatened with a cold, which two things happening one after the other would no doubt have thrown him into a rage, but that there was so much careful and mysterious planning to do, and almost every day Dickon came in, if only for a few minutes, to talk about what was happening on the moor, and in the lanes and hedges, and on the borders of streams. The things he had to tell about otters and badgers and water-rats' houses, not to mention birds' nests and field mice in their burrows, were enough to make you almost tremble with excitement when you heard all the intimate details from an animal charmer, and realized with what thrilling eagerness and anxiety the whole busy underworld was working. "They're same as us," said Dickon, "only they have to build their homes every year, and it keeps them so busy they fair scuffle to get 'em done." The most absorbing thing, however, was the preparations to be made before Colin could be transported with sufficient secrecy to the garden. No one must see the chair-carriage and Dickon and Mary after they turned a certain corner of the shrubbery and entered upon the walk outside the ivied walls. As each day passed, Colin had become more and more fixed in his feeling that the mystery surrounding the garden was one of its greatest charms. Nothing must spoil that. No one must ever suspect that they had a secret. People must think that he was simply going out with Mary and Dickon because he liked them and did not object to their looking at him. They had long and quite delightful talks about their route. They would go up this path and down that one, and cross the other, and go round among the fountain flower beds as if they were looking at the bedding out plants the head gardener, Mr. Roach, had been having arranged. That would seem such a rational thing to do that no one would think it at all mysterious. They would turn into the shrubbery walks and lose themselves until they came to the long walls. It was almost as serious and elaborately thought out as the plans of march made by great generals in times of war. Rumours of the new and curious things which were occurring in the invalids' apartments had of course filtered through the servants' hall into the stable-yards and out among the gardeners. But notwithstanding this, Mr. Roach was startled one day when he received orders from Master Colin's room to the effect that he must report himself in the apartment no outsider had ever seen, as the invalid himself desired to speak to him. "Well, well," he said to himself as he hurriedly changed his coat, "what's to do now? His Royal Highness that wasn't to be looked at, calling up a man he's never set eyes on." Mr. Roach was not without curiosity. He had never caught even a glimpse of the boy, and had heard a dozen exaggerated stories about his uncanny looks and ways and his insane tempers. The thing he had heard oftenest was that he might die at any moment, and there had been numerous fanciful descriptions of a humped back and helpless limbs given by people who had never seen him. "Things are changing in this house, Mr. Roach," said Mrs. Medlock, as she led him up the back staircase to the corridor on to which opened the hitherto mysterious chamber. "Let's hope they're changing for the better, Mrs. Medlock," he answered. "They couldn't well change for the worse," she continued, "and queer as it all is, there's them as finds their duties made a lot easier to stand up under. Don't you be surprised, Mr. Roach, if you find yourself in the middle of a menagerie and Martha Sowerby's Dickon more at home than you or me could ever be." There really was a sort of magic about Dickon, as Mary always privately believed. When Mr. Roach heard his name he smiled quite leniently. "He'd be at home in Buckingham Palace or at the bottom of a coal mine," he said. "And yet it's not impudence either. He's just fine, is that lad." It was perhaps well he had been prepared, or he might have been startled. When the bedroom door was opened, a large crow, which seemed quite at home perched on the high back of a carven chair, announced the entrance of the visitor by saying "Caw! Caw!" quite loudly. In spite of Mrs. Medlock's warning, Mr. Roach only just escaped being sufficiently undignified to jump backward. The young Rajah was neither in bed nor on his sofa. He was sitting in an armchair, and a young lamb was standing by him shaking its tail in feeding lamb fashion as Dickon knelt, giving it milk from its bottle. A squirrel was perched on Dickon's bent back, attentively nibbling a nut. The little girl from India was sitting on a big footstool looking on. "Here is Mr. Roach, Master Colin," said Mrs. Medlock. The young Rajah turned and looked his servitor over. At least, that was what the head gardener felt happened. "Oh, you are Roach, are you?" he said. "I sent for you to give you some very important orders." "Very good, sir," answered Roach, wondering if he was to receive instructions to fell all the oaks in the park, or to transform the orchards into water gardens. "I am going out in my chair this afternoon," said Colin. "If the fresh air agrees with me, I may go out every day. When I go, none of the gardeners are to be anywhere near the long walk by the garden walls. No one is to be there. I shall go out about 2 o'clock, and everyone must keep away until I send word that they may go back to their work." "Very good, sir," replied Mr. Roach, much relieved to hear that the oaks might remain and that the orchards were safe. "Mary," said Colin, turning to her, "what is that thing you say in India when you have finished talking and want people to go?" "You say, 'You have my permission to go,'" answered Mary. The Rajah waved his hand. "You have my permission to go, Roach," he said. "But remember, this is very important." "Caw! Caw!" remarked the crow, hoarsely but not impolitely. "Very good, sir. Thank you, sir," said Mr. Roach, and Mrs. Medlock took him out of the room. Outside in the corridor, being a rather good-natured man, he smiled until he almost laughed. "My word," he said, "he's got a fine lordly way with him, hasn't he? You'd think he was a whole royal family rolled into one, prince consort and all." "Eh," protested Mrs. Medlock, "we've had to let him trample over every one of us since he had feet, and he thinks that's what folks was born for." "Perhaps he'll grow out of it if he lives," suggested Mr. Roach. "Well, there's one thing pretty sure," said Mrs. Medlock. "If he does live, and that Indian child stays here, I'll warrant she teaches him that the whole orange does not belong to him, as Susan Sowerby says. And he'll be likely to find out the size of his own quarter." Inside the room, Colin was leaning back on his cushions. "It's all safe now," he said, "and this afternoon I shall see it. This afternoon I shall be in it." Dickon went back to the garden with his creatures, and Mary stayed with Colin. She did not think he looked tired, but he was very quiet before their lunch came, and he was quiet while they were eating it. She wondered why, and asked him about it. "What big eyes you've got, Colin," she said. "When you are thinking, they get as big as saucers. What are you thinking about now?" "I can't help thinking about what it will look like," he answered. "The garden?" asked Mary. "The springtime," he said. "I was thinking that I've really never seen it before. I scarcely ever went out, and when I did go I never looked at it. I didn't even think about it." "I never saw it in India because there wasn't any," said Mary. Shut in and morbid as his life had been, Colin had more imagination than she had, and at least he had spent a good deal of time looking at wonderful books and pictures. "That morning when you ran in and said, 'It's come, it's come,' you made me feel quite queer. It sounded as if things were coming with a great procession and big bursts and wafts of music. I've a picture like it in one of my books. Crowds of lovely people and children with garlands and branches with blossoms on them, everyone laughing and dancing and crowding and playing on pipes. That was why I said, 'Perhaps we shall hear golden trumpets,' and told you to throw open the window." "How funny," said Mary. "That's really just what it feels like, and if all the flowers and leaves and green things and birds and wild creatures danced past at once, what a crowd it would be. I'm sure they'd dance and sing and flute, and that would be the wafts of music." They both laughed, but it was not because the idea was laughable, but because they both so liked it. A little later the nurse made Colin ready. She noticed that instead of lying like a log while his clothes were put on, he sat up and made some efforts to help himself, and he talked and laughed with Mary all the time. "This is one of his good days, sir," she said to Dr. Craven, who dropped in to inspect him. "He's in such good spirits that it makes him stronger." "I'll call in again later in the afternoon, after he has come in," said Dr. Craven. "I must see how the going out agrees with him. I wish," in a very low voice, "that he would let you go with him." "I'd rather give up the case this moment, sir, than even stay here while it's suggested," answered the nurse with sudden firmness. "I hadn't really decided to suggest it," said the doctor with a slight nervousness. "We'll try the experiment. Dickon's a lad I'd trust with a newborn child." The strongest footman in the house carried Colin downstairs and put him in his wheeled chair near which Dickon waited outside. After the manservant had arranged his rugs and cushions, the Rajah waved his hand to him and to the nurse. "You have my permission to go," he said, and they both disappeared quickly, and it must be confessed giggled when they were safely inside the house. Dickon began to push the wheeled chair slowly and steadily. Mistress Mary walked beside it, and Colin leaned back and lifted his face to the sky. The arch of it looked very high, and the small snowy clouds seemed like white birds floating on outspread wings below its crystal blueness. The wind swept in soft, big breaths down from the moor, and was strange, with a wild, clear, scented sweetness. Colin kept lifting his thin chest to draw it in, and his big eyes looked as if it were they which were listening instead of his ears. "There are so many sounds of singing and humming and calling out," he said. "What is that scent the puffs of wind bring?" "It's the gorse on the moor that's opening out," answered Dickon. The bees are at it wonderful to-day." Not a human creature was to be caught sight of in the paths they took. In fact, every gardener or gardener's lad had been witched away. But they wound in and out among the shrubbery and out and around the fountain beds, following their carefully planned route, for the mere mysterious pleasure of it. But when at last they turned into the long walk by the ivied walls, the excited sense of an approaching thrill made them, for some curious reason they could not have explained, begin to speak in whispers. "This is it," breathed Mary. "This is where I used to walk up and down and wonder and wonder." "Is it?" cried Colin, and his eyes began to search the ivy with eager curiousness. "But I can see nothing," he whispered. "There is no door." "That's what I thought," said Mary. Then there was a lovely breathless silence, and the chair wheeled on. "That is the garden where Ben Weatherstaff works," said Mary. "Is it?" said Colin. A few yards more and Mary whispered again. "This is where the robin flew over the wall," she said. "Is it?" cried Colin. "Oh, I wish he'd come again." "And that," said Mary with solemn delight, pointing under a big lilac bush, "is where he perched on the little heap of earth and showed me the key." Then Colin sat up. "Where? Where? There?" he cried, and his eyes were as big as the wolf's in Red Riding Hood, when Red Riding Hood felt called upon to remark on them. Dickon stood still, and the wheeled chair stopped. "And this," said Mary, stepping onto the bed close to the ivy, "is where I went to talk to him when he chirped at me from the top of the wall. And this is the ivy the wind blew back," and she took hold of the hanging green curtain. "Oh, is it? Is it?" gasped Colin. "And here is the handle, and here is the door. Dickon, push him in quickly." And Dickon did it, with one strong, steady, splendid push. But Colin had actually dropped back against his cushions, even though he gasped with delight, and he had covered his eyes with his hands and held them there, shutting out everything, until they were inside, and the chair stopped as if by magic, and the door was closed. Not till then did he take them away and look round and round and round, as Dickon and Mary had done. And over the walls and earth and trees and swinging sprays and tendrils, the fair green veil of tender little leaves had crept, and in the grass under the trees and the grey urns in the alcoves, and here and there, everywhere, were touches or splashes of gold and purple and white, and the trees were showing pink and snow above his head, and there were fluttering of wings and faint sweet pipes and humming and scents. And the sun fell warm upon his face like a hand with a lovely touch. And in wonder Mary and Dickon stood and stared at him. He looked so strange and different, because a pink glow of colour had actually crept all over him, ivory face and neck and hands and all. "I shall get well. I shall get well," he cried out. "Mary, Dickon, I shall get well. And I shall live forever and ever and ever." End of chapter 20.